when you want images to come up and go down, I can operate all that from this end.
Right. Okay.
Yep. Okay. All right. So we'll mute it down and break a leg. I'll see you when you're done.
Right. We'll see you back here. Let's say we reactivate our cameras, everything 1 minute before we start, something like that. Alison, are you there actually? Just her thought. Silence in the ether. That's okay. I'll fix it. I'll fix it.
So I will just tell you, Rob, when to show the image.
Sorry, muted. Yes, I'll put it up. And then if you want to tell me when to take it down again, I can take it down again and bring it back to you, basically.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Sweeps didn't have the money to be able to give him the contract that I think he deserved.
Are we allowed to turn off our cameras?
I turned mine off. Yeah.
Jay Sexton.
Hey, Rob. Rob,
He's
you hear me?
muted.
Rob's muted, yeah.
Hi, Jeff. Hi.
Yeah, thank our sponsor.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we
Yeah, are you talking
Thank our
about,
sponsor, okay?
Are you talking about Logbook?
Yes. They came through, the sponsorship has happened, so. Good luck.
Okay, I think we're ready to make a start. So hopefully I can be heard. That will be the first problem. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Columbia, and good evening to Professor Colley in Europe. And welcome to the first of a pair of lectures for Constitution Day this year. These are the James E. Fleming and Linda C. Mclean Constitution Day lectures, and we're very grateful to both James and Linda for their generous support. Linda is Robert Kent Professor of Law at Boston University, and James, a Mizzou alum, is the Honorable Paul J. Liakos Professor of Law at Boston University. And I think they're both joining us on the Zoom today. So on behalf of the Institute, thank you for supporting what promises to be a really stimulating pair of lectures this year. A small couple of points of housekeeping before we start. Technical announcements. Please mute yourself when you join the channel. And when we start the lecture proper, I'll be running the slideshow, and it would be best if at the top of your Zoom windows, if you select, it will show it later, show small active speaker window. If you select that, I think it will maximize your viewing pleasure, as they say. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Professor Linda Colley is the Shelby M.C. Davis 1958 Professor of History at Princeton University and one of the most eminent scholars of global history. Before coming to Princeton in 2003, Professor Colley held the Senior Leverhulme Research Professorship at the London School of Economics and was the Richard M. Colgate Professor of History at Yale University and was the first female fellow of Christ's College, Cambridge. And throughout her career, Professor Colley's works on British, imperial, transnational, and global history have really driven our reinterpretations of each of those fields. So the task of summarizing her contribution for you is more than a little daunting. In Britain's Forging the Nation, 1707 to 1837, which won the Wolfson Prize in 1993, Professor Colley examined the formation of Britishness itself, the strains upon which, in light of what may well prove to be only the first referendum on Scottish independence of current times, she returns to examine in her 2014 book, Acts of Union and Disunion. In Captives, Britain, Empire and the World, and in The Ordeal of Elizabeth Marsh, A Woman in World History, Professor Colley not only stressed the vulnerability of empires, but meditated on the value of life writing, of studying individual lives as a means to get at the experience of living in a time of greater global connectivity. Well, this afternoon's talk draws upon her newest work, The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, Warfare, Constitutions and the Making of the Modern World, a book that I know a number of our students have been reading this semester. And specifically, Professor Colley is going to talk to us about the complex role played by print in the production of new constitutions around the world after 1750. Her paper today is entitled Spreading the Word, Written Constitutions and the Printing Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Linda Colley to deliver the first of our Constitution Day lectures.
Well, hello. Thank you, Rob. It's a great honor to be here, unfortunately on the other side of the Atlantic, brought to you through a miracle of technology only. I'm not able to be there, but it's a great honor. And thank you so much for the invitation, particularly Jay Sexton, who delivered the initial invitation. My title is Spreading the Word, Written Constitutions and the Printing Press. And I want to start with a familiar episode. Finally reaching a quorum on May 25th, 1787, the 50-odd delegates of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention embraced seclusion. Armed guards surrounded their place of meeting, the red brick State House on Philadelphia's Chestnut Street. And although that summer was typically humid, The windows of the State House were kept firmly shut. As for the green-painted meeting room itself, no spectators were admitted, and no journalists were allowed in systematically to report. The delegates themselves were under instructions not to pass on information on their debates to outsiders. And can we have the first image, please, Rob? And of course, the delegates met under the supervision of this man, who I hope you can see, George Washington himself, who sat listening to the debates day after day after day. And this is an early 19th century sculpture of Washington, showing him, of course, both as a general, in this case, a Roman general, and as a writer, a legislator. But it was not until September the 17th, 1787, that a complete draft of a new 4,500 or so word constitution for the United States was formally set down on 4 large sheets of parchment. And perhaps we can lose Washington, if I can put it that way. That same day, something of arguably even greater global import occurred. A copy of this draft constitution was passed to a John Dunlap and David Claypool, both Revolutionary Army veterans and proprietors of the first successful American daily, the Pennsylvania Packet. 2 days later, on September the 19th, Dunlap and Claypool published the text of the draft constitution in full on this newspaper's front page. By late October, it had featured in over 70 other American newspapers. And by the end of 1787, there had been at least 200 different American printings of the draft constitution, while extracts from it and complete copies were increasingly filtering into print in other countries and continents. In my lecture today, I want to investigate some of the consequences and meanings of these and later explosions of constitutional print, focusing on the years before the 1830s, but touching as well on some later events. Now, written or engraved outlines of rules of government and codes of law were ancient growths in many cultures. But the notion that a written constitution should, in the words of one Victorian journalist, be broad, explicit, and complete in itself, a discrete document possessing special status, outlining both the workings of a polity and certain rights, was a much later development. Only from the mid-18th century did political texts of this type begin proliferating at a notably faster, wider, and persistent rate. Note that the US Constitution was not the first such constitution, and neither were the American state constitutions the first. Can we have the next slide, please? This man, Pascal Paoli, in a rather unflattering Dutch engraving, organized with others a very interesting and quite radical written constitution for Corsica in 1755, providing for very high levels of male democracy. If you are unfamiliar with the 1755 Corsican Constitution, though, that's not really surprising, because at that time there were no printing presses in Corsica. And this extraordinary piece of paper was just written down, and the original indeed has been lost. When Gustav III of Sweden issued his form of government in 1772, however, another early written constitution which explicitly endorsed the idea of such a document operating as a supreme fundamental law, this was put into print in multiple languages. Nonetheless, although there were other precedents, the impact of the Constitution crafted at Philadelphia in 1787 was unprecedented, and not just because of its content, and we can lose Paoli too. It's suggestive, I think, that the new United States resembled Sweden in possessing both exceptionally high levels of literacy, at least among whites, and a rapidly expanding print sector. In addition, though, and unlike Sweden, the United States in 1787 was a recent republic confronted by both domestic challenges and potential threats from without. And it was this mix of circumstances, the scale of America's print culture and literacy on the one hand, and the scale of its post-independence internal and external challenges on the other, which help account for the degree to which print became such a vital resource here. The last article of the draft Constitution in 1787, you will remember, stipulated that it needed the approval of at least 9 of the 13 American states, all of them holding ratification conventions for the purpose. As you may know, and as has been increasingly documented, securing this level of ratification proved a close-run thing. Final ratification was not achieved until September 1788. And this protracted uncertainty meant that for months on end, American activists and advocates invested enormous amounts of energy and cash and print in publishing the draft Constitution at home and in issuing polemics in its support. These domestic print efforts were combined, moreover, with calculated print campaigns outside the United States. From the fall of 1787, print-intensive campaigns were launched to publicize the United States Constitution overseas. American diplomats, consuls, and patriotic merchants systematically distributed printed copies of the text to foreign rulers and other major players, while duplicates of the new Constitution were also regularly enfolded into American diplomatic correspondence. Now, the official thinking behind these efforts was that powerful actors overseas would be impressed by the provisions of the new Constitution and that they would also be persuaded by them that the new United States was now constructing a more effectual central government. This, it was hoped, would help deter potential armed invasions of America from without, something that was very much worried about at this time, while simultaneously reassuring and enticing overseas merchants and potential investors. These more official and concerted distribution of the American Constitution overseas was swamped in volume, however, by the coverage it received in foreign-based commercial print media. In this regard, the United States benefited hugely from the very empire it had rejected. There were naturally very old and close links between American printers and publishers and their counterparts in Ireland and Britain. Because of this, and because of the commonalities in language, printed political material issued in the United States regularly crossed the Atlantic. You get the first printing of the American Constitution in London just 5 weeks after the first printing in Philadelphia. Moreover, since London was then the world's biggest port with the largest mercantile marine, incoming American print material was frequently shipped onwards from London to other parts of Europe and also to Asia, West Africa, South America, the Caribbean, and ultimately to sectors of the Pacific world. And while London is the main foreign diffuser of this constitutional material from the United States, other polities are also sending out copies. France does, the German lands do, and so forth. But what about those on the receiving end? What were the long-term effects of so much printed material on American constitutionalism, relentlessly crossing land and maritime boundaries? Well, let's see. Now, there's no doubt that in the wake of the American Revolutionary War, which had itself commanded wide international attention, the extensive print publicity given to the work of the Philadelphia Convention helped both to spread the idea of a single document constitution across continents and to advertise the advantages of using printing presses to publicize and entrench such documents. There's no doubt, too, that over the long 19th century, the American Constitution was far more widely reproduced in print across continents than, say, the American Declaration of Independence. In part, this was because outside the Americas, declarations of independence remained very sparse phenomena until after the First World War. Written constitutions, by contrast, spread at an exponential rate. By 1914, they had already penetrated into parts of every continent, and the speed of transmission would increase after the First World War. Consequently, given its celebrity and given its capacity to endure, the American Constitution was regularly reissued in multiple languages over the long 19th century, in part so as to serve as an aid to constitution writers in other countries. Thus, in the revolutionary year of 1848, when much of Europe exploded into turbulence, and a new revolutionary constitution for France was again in process, there were at least 8 new French translations of the American Constitution, because people knew, publishers knew there would be a market, because a French constitution was in process and people were interested in models. At times, but I stress at times, this high and wide publicity profile resulted in other countries borrowing from the US Constitution's own provisions. More widely, though, there was marked emulation abroad of those print strategies that Americans had deployed so successfully in order to advance and cement their constitution. One sees both of these trends at work in regard to the constitution issued in 1811 by oppositionists in Venezuela, the first South American region to declare independence from Spain. Now, at one level, these early Venezuelan activists appropriated some of the political content and provision of the US Constitution. They provided, for instance, in their own draft constitution, for the creation of a federal republic and for the creation of a House of Representatives and Senate. Like many other polities in and after the 19th century, Venezuelans also borrowed the American tactic of compiling print portfolios of their new constitutional documents and then disseminating these in print in the hope of influencing opinion overseas. Together with other texts, a copy of this new Venezuelan constitution was promptly dispatched to London. Here, bound editions were published in 1812 with Spanish and English versions on alternate pages, ready to be shipped to multiple locations overseas, in the hope that the new Venezuela would win widespread international support. But for all its constitutional activism and its print ingenuity, this first Venezuelan republic quickly failed. Its lavish printed and circulated portfolio endured, however, part of what was becoming by now a rapidly expanding print archive of different countries' constitutional projects. And this is a crucial point. Attention often focuses on how the American Constitution provoked political, ideological, legal, and institutional emulation elsewhere. But quite as important were the ways in which such enterprise on the part of Americans helped to bring into being other competing constitutional systems in different parts of the world and rival written and printed constitutional texts. As more and more countries adopted written constitutions, and as more and more of them turned to printing presses to publicize these texts at home and abroad. Men and women interested in this form of political technology, a written constitution, were presented with a widening choice. Not only could they study, and if they so wish, plunder the United States' own constitution, progressively they were in a position also to secure information on constitutions generated by other nations and empires, and if they wish, borrow selectively from them as well. The consequences of this amazing process of borrowing, which increases all the time, were many and mixed. Let me just touch briefly on three of them. First of all, and this is one reason why cultural and literary scholars could profitably pay more attention to constitutions. The growing print availability of texts of this sort led to a rise in what can be called informal or amateur constitution writing. It became more common for private individuals possessed of sufficient literacy, time, and enthusiasm to embark on and sometimes publish their own attempts at a written constitution for a real or perhaps an imagined location. In the same way as they might embark on writing a novel, say, or a piece of journalism. And there's lots of examples of this. For example, Charles Stewart Parnell, the great Irish nationalist of the late 19th century. Part of Parnell's legend is that even as a schoolboy, he was drafting his own private constitutions for a future free Ireland. Now, we don't know if this is true or not, but it's certainly the case that writing these amateur constitutions became a noted cultural practice, though mainly among males. It's a rainy day, you've got nothing to do. So you sit down and you spend the afternoon drafting your own private constitution for Sicily or Kansas or whatever. That's what people sometimes did. But as I say, almost always male people. The second point I'd like to make is this: the degree to which multiple constitutions were put into wide print circulation progressively resulted in a new politics of extraction, appropriation, and comparison. Those engaged in drafting official constitutions were more and more able to adopt a policy of pick and mix. They could and did study and select between ideas, institutions, laws, and language set out in an expanding print array of other countries' constitutions. They would then meld and combine these borrowings and inspirations with their own indigenous ideas and legal and political practices. And could we see the next slide, please? And you can see this kind of pick and mix strategy at work in 1814 in the making of Norway's constitution. And this is a Victorian painting of what one might call Norway's founding fathers, working on their constitution in great haste in 1814. Next to the American Constitution, this Norwegian Constitution is the oldest such document still operating today, albeit having passed through many more amendments than the American variety. And what is striking about this Norwegian text, apart from its longevity, is how much it drew on borrowings. There were multiple borrowings in it, and in some cases, verbatim translations from the French revolutionary constitutions of 1791, 1793, and 1795, the American constitutions, the Polish Constitution of 1791, the Dutch Constitution of 1798, the Swedish of 1809, the Spanish of 1812, and more. In other words, already by the early 19th century, constitutions are coming to be rather like patchwork quilts. They're put together from pieces taken from other sources, other constitutional writings produced in other countries available in print. And this has been a continuing trend. You can see it operating still, for example, in the making of the Indian Constitution in the late 1940s. My third point is this. The fact that written constitutions were made up of words and therefore perfectly suited to being reproduced infinitely and in different languages by way of print has been a prime reason why these devices have become now almost universal. Yes. But since constitutions were and are political as well as legal texts, they have always been subject to multiple readings and interpretations, even in their own country of origin. Once translated and issued in other countries, however, constitutions tended to become still more volatile. Take the way in which the Plan de Iguala of February 1821 was retooled in different locations by those contending against modes of empire and oppression. And can we see the next slide, please? And the Plan de Iguala was primarily the work of this man, the Mexican General Iturbide, who, as you see, was a Mexican revolutionary who came to have his own monarchical ambitions. And it is important to remember that constitutions are pushed not only by republics, but increasingly by monarchies as well. I also include this image, which hangs in Philadelphia at present, to illustrate my point about the importance of print. Can we see the detail from this picture? You'll see that Iturbide was painted holding a Spanish edition collection of American constitutions. Now, Iturbide had monarchical and imperial ambitions, as I say, but his text, the Plan de Iguala, was originally issued as a blueprint for the government of a future independent Mexico, and some of its provisions were radical. The plan's 12th clause especially proved highly influential and eminently exportable. all the inhabitants of New Spain, in other words, Mexico, without any distinction of Europeans, Africans, or Indians, are citizens of this monarchy and eligible for every office according to their merit and virtue. Once translated and set in motion, this passage from this early Mexican constitution, the Plan de Iguala, could be and was adopted and adapted by those in other countries pressing for more generous political rights and better treatment for all males, not females, of course, irrespective of religion, skin color, ethnicity, or colonial status. And we can move on now. By 1822, for instance, this kind of egalitarian gloss on the wider implications of the Plan de Iguala had reached Calcutta in the Indian subcontinent, already one of the world's great centers of print. Along with translations of other South American constitutions, extracts from the Plan de Iguala were published in the Calcutta Journal, the first ever Indian daily newspaper. Its radical owners, the Englishman James Silk Buckingham and Ramahan Roy, who was a high-status Brahmin from Bengal, chose in one issue of their newspaper to highlight this self-same clause from the Plan de Iguala. All the inhabitants of New Spain, without any distinction of Europeans, Africans, or Indians, are citizens of this monarchy and eligible in every office according to their merit and virtue. Now, the word Indians obviously meant something very different in Calcutta than in Mexico, and this was the point. For Ramahan Roy and for James Silk Buckingham, this Mexican Plan de Iguala offered useful ammunition for some of what they hoped to achieve within the Indian subcontinent itself. Not an end to rule by the British East India Company, which at this stage seemed beyond possibility, but rather reforms in the company's government and an altered British Empire in which, without any distinctions of Europeans or Indians, as the Plan de Iguala put it, all males might be treated according to their merit and virtue. By this stage, the 1820s indeed, some optimistic observers were already envisaging a world in which, primed by print, written and reforming constitutions would become fully global phenomena. But while print proved vital for the advance of written constitutions, print by itself, even apart from the variations in its availability across the globe, was never enough. And there's lots of examples of this. If one thinks of China, print, like paper, is a remarkably early invention in what is now China. But it's not until the late 19th century that constitutional projects on paper begin to be seriously studied by members of the Chinese bureaucracy. Print, in other words, was certainly invaluable for the evolution, workings, and effectiveness of written constitutions, but by itself, print was never enough. The interests and ideas and ideologies of those in possession of prime political and military power were usually of more decisive importance. And one sees a dramatic proof of this in the United States itself in the 1820s. By this stage, the 1820s, the 13 American states, which the delegates at Philadelphia had taken for granted back in 1787, had expanded to 24 states, while the registered American population had tripled. Left out of the official United States Census listings, however, were Native Americans, not generally liable for tax. These peoples were not included among the US citizenry. Neither in the main were they slaves. So what were they? In 1827, leading activists among the 15,000 or so Cherokee, based largely by this time in the emerging state of Georgia, along with some missionaries active among them, decided that what these people were in fact was an independent nation, and consequently that the Cherokees deserved and required their own written constitution. Since the early 1820s, the Cherokee had acquired access, of course, to print, that crucial, sometimes game changer. And can we see the next image, please? And one of the Cherokee at this time, a man called Sequoyah, about whom we still know not enough, had moreover invented a writing system which allowed the Cherokee language to be read, set down on paper, and put into type. One result of this was that in 1827, leading Cherokee were able to hold a convention and adopt a constitution for their future government. And could we see the image? Here we are, Constitution of the Cherokee Nation. Note that. Like so many other constitution makers, these Cherokee legislators cut and pasted, quite deliberately replicating parts of the US Constitution. We, the representatives of the people of the Cherokee Nation in convention established, is how this Constitution begins. But these Cherokee activists also set down in precise geographical detail the territorial boundaries of this Cherokee Nation, which they insisted in print were hereafter to remain unalterably the same. In other words, this document was not just about internal Cherokee affairs and government. It was intended, hopefully, to halt the spread of white settlers into lands that the Cherokee regarded as their own. But neither this particular vision of the land nor the Cherokee claim to be a free and distinct nation with the right to govern itself secured traction. Both the US federal government in Washington and the all-white Georgia legislature rejected the legality of this document and the validity of Cherokee national aspirations. In the 1830s, most Cherokee were driven out of Georgia and relocated further west, some 4,000 of them dying in transit. It seems a distinctively American frontier tragedy, but I think we can see it as more than that. At one level, this Cherokee episode underlines again a crucial theme of this lecture: how closely and how frequently access to print and printing presses was linked to evolving constitution writing. At another level, though, this same episode also confirms how, in regard to constitutions, the opportunities and ideas nurtured by print could be suppressed and pushed to one side by those in possession of superior levels of power. Yet this Cherokee initiative also stands as a reminder that, like print itself, written and printed constitutions have always been volatile entities. Securing a monopoly on these devices proved over the years increasingly difficult. To paraphrase the great political scientist Benedict Anderson, a written and published constitution proved an invention on which it was impossible to secure a patent. Like other works susceptible to print, written constitutions easily became, as Anderson writes, available for pirating by widely different and sometimes unexpected hands. And this would be the case in many other parts of the world. This Cherokee case is an example of a failure in constitution writing by indigenous people because of suppression. But you get indigenous constitutions following this in the Americas and also elsewhere in the Pacific world, for example. And the Pacific world demonstrates another way in which print and the spread of print feeds into this constitutional phenomena. From the 1790s, you're getting increasing spreads of Christian missionaries in the Pacific world. They often bring with them printing presses to print Bibles and prayer books in the local languages. And sometimes local indigenous chiefs seize hold of these missionary printing presses to issue their own law codes and early constitutions. This is what happens in Hawaii, for instance, from 1840 onwards. Here then is yet a further illustration of the value of print in the past for the advance and implementation of written constitutionalism. But what of now? Today, growing numbers of us in the United States and elsewhere inhabit societies where men and women get the bulk of their political information from a screen, not from the printed page. Moreover, this digital age is relentlessly bringing about a balkanization of data and debate in regard to politics and allegiance as much else. We have left behind forever a narrow aperture world where individuals rely heavily for their political orientation on just a few TV and radio channels and just a few major newspapers and other print sources. Instead, here in the US, as in many other countries, there is now a positive cacophony of political influences and political voices transmitted by way of multiple media. The implications of these ongoing communication changes are momentous, not least for the status, operation, and futures of written political constitutions that once relied so heavily on the printed word and on print networks. And this is a point which really does require more recognition, analysis, and thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Colley. Thank you for such a stimulating and wide-ranging paper with all manner of different directions and thoughts contained within. In terms of running the questions, there's a couple of ways to do this. If you're in the video call and you'd like to raise a question, please use the hand raise function, and I will be able to see that and invite you to ask a question. And similarly, if you're actually on site at the Kinder Institute, Jeff Pasley, now waving, will be able to in person take questions, and we'll get some questions from the floor as well. So I'd like to open it up to questions first. Jeff, is there anyone initially in the room who has a question would like to go first? You'll need to unmute, Jeff. That's the only caveat there.
Should we have her come up?
Yeah.
She's good at they can hear her.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
So Maya has a question.
Maya, please ask your question.
Okay. Hello. Thank
Hello.
you. I was hello. I was wondering if you could talk more about the Cherokee Constitution and like specifically what influences they had, because like if you look at state constitutions compared to the federal one, they're very similar, but from what I could read on like the little bit of the picture there, it seemed obviously like quite different, and obviously they have like different influences. So yeah.
I mean, the publication, and you can find it online, this Cherokee Constitution, it's really worth having a look at. As you will have noticed from the brief show, it's printed both in Cherokee and in the English language in adjacent panels. And I mean, not all of it, I should say, is particularly advanced. The Cherokee keep slaves, and this constitution endorses that. But what is striking about this constitution, and it really tells you a lot about geography, is just how minutely these Cherokee legislators have really walked through the land or surveyed the land they claimed. And they really do say, you know, up to that stretch of the river, up to the third hill, and so on and so on. They really want to demarcate their boundary. And to that extent, actually, in some ways, this Cherokee Constitution is very like early American state constitutions, which also spend a lot of time setting out borders often claiming borders in defiance of Indian claims. And in a sense, the Cherokee are hitting back at this, saying, well, we want to set out our boundaries. Thank you very much. And it's a very striking document, and it is taken notice of by other indigenous groupings in the United States who make later attempts, though not particularly successful attempts, to issue their own tribal constitutions, if you like.
Thank you. I had a question about this process of sort of selective translation of constitutions as they move as physical documents in circulation. And it's about the sort of human equivalent to that. I mean, if you think about the era of decolonization, they've become these sort of often colonially appointed quasi-experts who shuttle between a variety of frontiers, sites, writing constitutions in the 20th century. But in the period you're looking at, I wondered, are there also these individuals also in motion alongside the paper that's in motion, sort of interpreting, advocating for these documents in person as well?
Well, I mean, some of the earliest are warmongers. I mean, I suppose you could say that Napoleon is, one of the earliest constitutional activists in foreign spaces. I mean, as he builds up his European empire, which ends up quite large, he often causes to be drafted, or himself partially drafts a constitution for this particular conquest. And he does this sometimes to implement relatively emancipated ideas like toleration of Jews, the end of feudal rights. But he also wants to legislate for more local taxes and for conscription. So that this new conquest will produce males for his huge French imperial armies. But you're getting, by the last third of the 19th century, something closer to what we have now, namely professional lawyers and draftsmen who regard it as part of their duty and part of their trade to go to other countries who are drafting a new constitution and lend their expertise. And you can see that happening already in the 1870s and 1880s. Various foreign jurists travel to Japan to give advice on the making of the Japanese Constitution of 1889. But that kind of system really has to wait until you've got advanced networks of steamships and steam trains, so that these foreign experts can be bussed in, as it were, to different parts of the globe.
Thank you. Great. Okay, it looks like we've got a question in the chat from Al. Al, I'm going to pick on you and ask you to turn your camera on and speak, if that's okay, rather than me read out your question.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Linda. I mean, I was interested in this from many levels. I'm interested in the print culture dimension, the spread through Europe, but I didn't expect you to turn to the Cherokee at the end there, which is, I work on some Cherokee history. So I was really interested in where this fit in. And so I was wondering, I mean, this emphasis on the specificity of the land borders doesn't seem odd to me, right? It's not that dissimilar from the same things that had to be laid out in every treaty and session and conference with the US government. So to me, it just seems kind of in a longer history of that. But I was wondering if perhaps then that's gesturing at the way many of the Cherokees are seeing the Constitution, that this is something produced less for internal governments, though certainly somewhat for, but much more for external viewing, that this is part of this, look, we're engaging in what you wanted as assimilation. We're taking on these trappings and we're producing a document that is going to assuage both local American settlers, but also the US government. And so I was just wondering like where this fits in the same way you talked about the US Constitution and then the printings of all of this and everyone looking to prevent foreign invasions, how much this fits in actually into a relatively similar framing. And then I was also curious about your reading of the kind of contested validity of it. Certainly Georgia contests the validity. They proclaim that all Georgia law applies to Cherokee peoples because they're no longer citizens of their own nation. And Cherokee v. Georgia in 1831 certainly sides with that. That's why Marshall refuses to hear the case. But Worcester v. Georgia, my reading is that it comes down quite the opposite, that in 1832, the federal government has decided the Cherokee are sovereign, that they are citizens of their own nation, and certainly Georgia law doesn't apply to them, actually setting up a major issue between Georgia and federal reading. So I'm kind of curious too about the way the Cherokee Constitution is being read, maybe at different levels, how this has to do with the way they're projecting this outward.
Yeah, well, I mean, you clearly know much more about the Cherokee than I do, so, which is great. I think you're right that, I mean, we have to remember that it's not just Cherokee activists who are behind this constitution. There are also American missionaries active among them. And, there's clearly sensitivity at different levels about what bells this document should ring, if you like, and the missionaries are giving advice and the Cherokee have their priorities too. By drawing attention to the issue of borders, though, I take your point about treaties, but I also do think this is something that US state constitutions often do in the early 19th century as well. They are, and indeed not just in the early 19th century, if you look at the first Californian state constitution in, I think, 1848, 1849, that's talking a lot about territorial boundaries too, as of course it has to, because it's thinking, well, what about Mexico? What about, given that the Native American population in California is at that stage quite high, and the American white population is quite small. The issue of borders and of trying to use words, printed words, to cement borders and to win recognition of them is very important. And I think you see that in a lot of constitutions. And I think it fits in with this point that over time, and my latest book is, a lot of it is about that, constitutions are often the product of some kind of existential challenge. You are in the middle of being invaded, or you fear an invasion, or you've just emerged from a terrible war of independence, or you're threatened by some external force. And this tends to concentrate people's minds. Sorry, and one of the results is often a new constitution. And this is the case with the Norwegian Constitution of 1814. It's a rapid document, and they borrow so ruthlessly, partly because they know that the Swedish armies are advancing against them, and they really want to finish their own constitution before they get possibly taken over. So constitutions often emerge from some kind of situation of threat or a certain concatenation of pressures, if you like, which is one reason why it's often difficult seriously to rewrite constitutions, because politicians usually don't want to do this if they don't have to. You could argue, and I'm a foreigner, so you can shoot me down if you want, but it seems to me that you could make a very good case for quite a serious rewrite of the American Constitution in patches, but I can't personally see it happening at the moment anyway.
Thank you.
Rob, we have a question here.
Great. Over to the floor then, Jeff.
It's interesting to me to think about I'd like actually to ask Professor Colley to think about how the use of the Constitution has changed here in this age. We haven't stopped using them now, even though we're in this age of or away from the age of print. So think about that. But I'm going to go to a question from Rosie on the floor here.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Before you were talking about the differences between just borrowing straight from the American Constitution and actually borrowing their methods of dissemination. And I wondered to what extent the Cherokee Constitution that you mentioned, they borrowed specific clauses and wording, but did they ever borrow that same dissemination more globally? And do you think that's in part why it was much more easily overturned by the US?
I'm fascinated by the interest in the Cherokee Constitution, which is great. I doubt they would have had the resources, because there's only about 15,000 Cherokee. They are not a rich people. They are under pressure. And what good would it have done them to distribute copies to other countries? No other country would have come to their aid. But you do see by some stronger non-Western territories the use of the dissemination of constitutions to try to preserve indigenous freedom from white takeover. And the conspicuous example of that, which works for a while, is with Hawaii. Hawaii, as I said, issues its own constitution in 1840, having played around with a kind of Bill of Rights a few years before that. And there is a succession of Hawaiian constitutions, and they're partly to organize internal government. Again, quite interesting and advanced documents, but they are, because Hawaii is both hard pressed, but it has more resources. It has a centralized monarchy. Hawaii does have translations of its constitution made and transmitted across Europe to Russia, ultimately to Japan. And it does so partly to try and anchor its independence. It fears being taken over by Europeans. Increasingly and understandably, it fears being taken over by the United States. And one of the things that a constitution increasingly is seen as doing in the 19th century is being a sign of modernity, that you are a modern state, and therefore you have a written and printed constitution. And Hawaii clearly sees this as a way of underlining their own autonomy and making clear that they are not, or at least they should not, be a target of some other power's imperialism. And you find Tunisia, which issues the first modern Islamic constitution in 1861, acting in exactly the same manner. You issue a constitution, you publish it in different languages, you disseminate it to say, look, here we are, we're on the map, we have our own written and printed public constitution, thank you very much. We are not a target for invasion. I have to say this often doesn't work, but you can see this strategy being tried out by territories which feel themselves vulnerable to Western imperialism.
Great, thank you, Professor Colley. There's a question in the Zoom, so I'm going to ask Robert Paulet to ask. Robert.
Sorry, two-income family. There's a call in the background too. So can you hear me okay?
Yep, coming through good.
Okay. I just and my question relates to what you were just saying, that, of course, right, drafting a constitution defines, the people drafting it, right, and who we are and what we won't stand for and all this. But in this culture of print too, right, constitution is also subjected to ratification. Right, who the power is to actually ratify and make official and give it the force of law, right? And this gets to some of the points that Al raised a bit ago. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that process, like that, because that culture of print, right, it opens it to everyone. It opens it, and at what point, and maybe this is, I'm not seeking a clear definition here. We're talking about, the difference between a constitution and a petition, right? Where, what work is being done by these things that are calling themselves constitution that aren't being done by other petitions against imperial government? If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, one of the things that constitutions tend increasingly to stress is that they are fundamental laws. They are not to be overturned by a normal legislative body. That's rather different from a petition. But you're certainly right that they can overlap slightly often more than slightly, in having a kind of manifesto and propaganda function. You issue these in print to set out your position, to set out your stall and say, here I am, this is what it's about. And so to that extent, yeah, there is overlap, but a constitution also has more to it than that. Okay.
Thank you. Right. I'm going to hand back to you now, Jeff. Back in the room.
We've got a couple in the room. Max student, and then Andrew at two.
Hi, I'm Max. I was just wondering, with the dispersal of the U.S. Constitution abroad, can it also be seen as like a stimulus of technology within abroad countries that might not have had such an emphasis on the print culture yet, to where they saw the U.S. Constitution and then started to value the I guess like the success that the U.S. Constitution had internationally, and then started to be more interested in a press culture domestically?
I think that's a very interesting question, to which I don't fully know the answer. What I think you can say is draw attention to the other side of that, that I fear that one of the things that the spread of written and printed constitutions does is that it can further disadvantage those peoples who do not have a written language. This becomes more and more of an issue. But it also becomes an issue for certain Islamic peoples who have a long tradition of learning and political texts that are written, but very often sparse or non-existent printing presses. And it takes the Islamic world quite a long time to play catch up, partly because there can be resistance from conservatives. The Tunisian Constitution of 1861 is got rid of in 1864, partly because of Western pressure, but partly also pressure from local Islamic clerics who just don't like some of its more secular provisions. So there is an issue in the Islamic world here where print is less widespread for a long time. But certainly you also get Muslim activists, and this would answer your question in part, saying not so much specifically with regard to America, but saying more generally, look, this is the game that everyone's playing now. We have to have our own constitution, and we have to print it, and we have to translate it, and we have to distribute it. And that means printing presses, and that should be part of much wider modernization, which if we don't do, basically the West will clobber us. So, I think constitutions have, and the way they're so tied up increasingly with print, has all sorts of ramifications for different peoples who perhaps may not have the same kind of print resources as most European and American states do have by the early 1800s.
Great
Rob,
question.
we have one more question in the room, or do you have another one? You have one each, or?
Jeff, you ask yours next, and then we come back here.
Okay, and Twitty.
Sure, I'll go ahead and stand up even though I'm on the front row.
He's got so he can.
Sure thing. It's hard to tell who's speaking with masks. So my question is about the civil law, civil code tradition in continental Europe and the extent to which this history of writtenness, written codes, the circulation of written laws sort of softens the ground such that when then there is the dissemination of the United States Constitution or American state constitutions, the ground has already sort of been prepared for a document like a constitution, like a written constitution. So just curious about your reflections on that longer tradition and its intersection with the advent of these written constitutions.
Yeah, very good question. And of course, some scholars have said, well, actually, there's just a kind of long continuity of constitutional development, at least in the Western tradition, if not elsewhere. That after all, the word constitution comes from a Latin word. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, played with certain notions of what we could call early constitutions. But there's a huge difference, I think, and classical historians like Melissa Lane, who have worked on this, I think, corroborate that. And one of the differences, of course, is that, yes, you can look at some of these great Greek and Roman thinkers, and they were certainly an influence in the 18th century still. I mean, we know that Pascal Paoli loved the ancient classics, and was certainly influenced by them when he came to write the 1755 Corsican Constitution. So there's certainly a long tradition there. But what is utterly different by the 18th century is the scale of literacy in parts of the world and the scale of print, so that these become mass-produced documents to a degree, not just written texts which are pored over by very, very narrow intellectual and ruling elites. And that seems to me to be a really important shift.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got one last question here from the chat, and that's from Jay Sexton. Jay.
Where's he?
I'm here. I'm here.
Next door, mysteriously. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was just absolutely fantastic, and I want to give both you and Rob a big shout out. I mean, this is Friday night. You guys should be you guys should be your Netflix time or whatever it is already late in the day. So we really appreciate it.
Well, actually, I must confess, I'm thinking rather in terms of a glass of wine than
yes.
Netflix myself.
Well, wine and Netflix, they go together. But hey, I'm gonna ask you one last question about women and gender. I mean, it came up in the paper a couple of times about obviously women aren't afforded the same position within these early constitutions as men, and they're obviously not writing them. And you pointed out not even the amateur constitutions that you're also interested in. And in the book, you really explain this in relation to how these constitutions are products of these kind of wartime exigencies, and how citizenship and military service kind of get fused. But I was thinking as you were talking about how the print culture theme might also be part of that explanation for this. I mean, after all, the early world of print, like the early world of formal politics, is very patriarchal. It's a male-dominated space, and though you have these high literacy rates among women, at least in parts of the Atlantic world in this period, they don't have the same position within this emerging print culture. So I guess I was just wondering, and this was something that when we read your book in class, we talked a lot about the women theme, and I just wonder if how far you would take the print thing as an explanation alongside what you emphasize, obviously, in the book about military service and the wars.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that so often in the book, I found myself floating ideas which I hope other people will run with, either agreeing or disputing or whatever. And my sense is that there's lots more to be done about women in this regard. I say, and I believe it is fundamentally true, that this amateur constitutionalism, as I call it, is overwhelmingly a male practice. But it is possible that, some female manuscript constitutions were written, but perhaps they were destroyed or just not kept or what. But I just have not come across any references to them. And I've asked various women's historians and so forth, but it would be nice to be proved wrong on that point. And with print, I think actually it's the paradox that is interesting. Certainly, if you look at Britain, if you look at France, if you look at the United States, particularly, from about the 1760s, the number of female published authors of poetry, of novels, in some cases, well, certainly, patriotic statements, things like that, is on the increase. You think of the, the great female novelists of this period, Jane Austen, for heaven's sake. So women are venturing into print. Now, of course, many of them are venturing, like the Bronte sisters, under false names. So there's still a residual problem with women in print. But there are more published female authors, which in a sense makes it more of a perplexing issue. Of course, women are progressively and more formally excluded from public life. But you'd think there might be some kind of protest against that, This is what I would write if I could write a constitution kind of publication, but I just haven't found them. And it's intriguing. Is it that, which I think is part of the answer, that, human beings at all stages put certain blocks very often on what they allow themselves to think. And the influence of gender constraints are very important here. But there's more to it than that, and there's more to it than issues of war and the capacity to fight in war, or the perceived capacity to fight in war. So I'm not fully satisfied with the answers I produced in the book, but I think it's an intriguing area which I hope others will explore.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a great note to end today's first part of the Constitution Day lectures on. This exhortation that we should go out and think about these things more, and from a global historical perspective too. I think that's quite right. Before we come together, just to thank Professor Colley, I'd just like to say that this is part one of a two-part, a double header, I think you call them in the States, not entirely sure. That's probably the wrong sporting terminology, of the James Fleming and Linda Mclean Constitution Day lectures. Our second lecture is called The Unwritten Constitution by Professor George Thomas, and I think that starts at 3 o'clock Columbia time. 3:30 Columbia time. Okay, well, do rejoin us for that. However, thank you very much, Professor Linda Colley, for starting us off with a really provocative and wide-ranging lecture. So please come together and join me in thanking Professor Colley. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. And I love the sound of the next lecture. I wish I was energetic enough to stay for it, but I hope perhaps you can send me a copy. Anyway, great to see you all. Take care.
I think that glass of wine is well earned, so go and enjoy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Linda. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
I guess you could leave. I was going to say, but you have to. She wanted to. All right.